Welcome to the 12th Jaipur Literature Festival, and we are here at the Darbar Hall. We've got meetings with remarkable manuscripts. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are here at the Darbar Hall, and we've got meetings with remarkable manuscripts. Christopher the Hamel, introduced by Dan Jones. Can we please give them a round of applause?
Thank you very much. My name's Dan Jones. It's my great pleasure and an enormous privilege to welcome Christopher de Hamel to the Jaipur Literature Festival to talk about his book, Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts. Now, Christopher's been meeting remarkable manuscripts for more than 40 years, and for much of that time, he's used his deep and wide knowledge of manuscript production in his role at the great London auction house, Sotheby's. In 2000, he became a fellow of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and became librarian of the world-famous Matthew Parker Library. He's the author of many excellent books about manuscripts, but none, I think, have had the same impact on historical publishing and public appreciation of the treasures of the medieval world as Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts, which was published in 2016. It's a unique book. It's not actually a manuscript itself, but it's been crafted with the same expertise, love, care, and mastery of the pen as any of the extraordinary documents that it describes. Now, Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts defies easy definition. It's part travelogue, part memoir, part medieval history, and many other parts besides. It's beautifully presented. It's lavishly illustrated. It's the only book that I've had other historians actually ring me up to boast that they'd had a copy of before publication. It borrows its title from Gurdjieff's Meetings with Remarkable Men, I think, and it shares themes of travel, interrogation of memories, and the quest for hidden truths. Above all, it's a book that takes deep joy in its subject. And in his introduction, Christopher writes, "If there's a single theme which I would try to convey, it is what pleasure you can have in looking at manuscripts." And we're so lucky that he's here today at the Jaipur Literature Festival to share that pleasure with us. Please, Christopher.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the eye-catching front cover of the book, which I'm asked to speak about this afternoon, shows a stylized tree with colored leaves. At first glance, it might easily be mistaken for Indian marble inlay from Rajasthan, as depicted here, showing the Tree of Life. And indeed, the same scene is also painted on the panels around the side of this room. It is in fact taken from an illuminated manuscript in Latin of the commentaries of Beatus of Liébana, made in Spain in the 10th century. Now, in New York, the actual image shows the vision of Nebuchadnezzar, who, according to the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, had a dream of a tree full of birds. It was interpreted for him by the prophet Daniel as a portent of imminent disaster. For, according to the explanation, the tree is about to be cut down, and the king will be cast out, and he will live naked among the cattle, and he will eat grass. As a symbol for the publication of my book, this sounds like very bad news indeed. The manuscript itself includes a double-page map of the entire world. I'm having some trouble with the pictures. What do you do? I don't know what she did that I didn't do. The manuscript includes a double-page map of the world, at least as they knew it in 10th century Europe, and you probably can't see it, but at the top right, which I have marked with a little arrow, is the word India. As Beatus of Liébana knew, India was a fabled land near the site of paradise. And there were found here precious stones such as rubies and emeralds and diamonds, and the famous mountains of gold, which I'm very much hoping to see this week. Guarded, people were told, by griffins and dragons. And there were other impossible mythological animals here, such as the elephant, which is shown in another Beatus manuscript to the same date, with a hairstyle like Donald Trump. Let me tell you how my interest in medieval manuscripts all started. Although I was born in London, my father took a job in New Zealand in the mid-1950s. We travelled out twice with my brothers on various steamships, and on one trip we stopped in India, in Bombay as it was then called, and we did indeed see elephants. I have got nearly 150 pictures, so I hope we can make the system work. And I rode on one for almost the only time in my life. The voyage to New Zealand took about a month, and we settled eventually. Oops. I'm having trouble with this. We settled eventually in Dunedin, towards the bottom of the South Island there, about as far from medieval Europe as it's possible to imagine. It was an old-fashioned Scottish city called after the old name for Edinburgh, and traditional learning was still taken very seriously there. After school one day, I stumbled on the Dunedin Public Library, which I show you in the old Edwardian building in Moray Place. You went in through that central door and doubled back up a wooden staircase to a mezzanine gallery. And there, as I found on my first visit, were long glass cases displaying medieval manuscripts and early printed books. There were 2 illuminated manuscript books of hours. I'm not absolutely sure whether I'm going to have to ask for the pictures to be moved on mechanically. I don't know whether that's going to be, where the organisers have gone, whether that's going to be easier, because this system is not working. There were 2 illuminated books of hours, one made in France and the other made in England, which you still can't see. Is there anyone in charge there? Can I move them on mechanically? Can I just say next, and will you do it? Is that okay? Okay, let's do that. You'll have to forgive me. You're going to hear the word next about 100 times. There were many fragments of manuscripts bought as specimen leaves. The largest of these were in frames hanging on the library stairs, leading up to the reference department, including this, next please, from a 14th century Bolognese choir book made in Italy, and a delightful miniature from a French book of hours showing the flight into Egypt. Next please. These absolutely astounded me, as rare and exotic as elephants or mountains of gold. Hang on. You're going too fast. We're not ready for that yet, please. In India, as indeed in Europe, we are surrounded by a literate culture which is thousands of years old. It's different in New Zealand. The country has notable indigenous prehistory and an important place in colonial expansion and modern politics and economics, but what it lacks is any equivalent to the Middle Ages. There are no medieval Gothic cathedrals or ancient temples or medieval sites as are found all across Europe and southern Asia. All they can realistically possess are specimen manuscripts of the Middle Ages. The earliest manuscript in the Dunedin Public Library, and actually the oldest then known in Australasia, is a framed leaf from a 9th century gospel book. Picture, please. No. Please go back, yeah. Perhaps in world terms, this is not very important, but to me, in Dunedin, no, can we have the next. Is there any? Oh, for God's sake. I'm really sorry. The pictures are fairly well timed. Perhaps in world terms, this is not very important, but to me it was absolutely magical. I collected stamps as a schoolboy, and my earliest example was mid-19th century. And I thought it was unimaginably old. But this, however, was 1,000 years old. The public library in Dunedin, to give them all credit, encouraged me, and they allowed me to take things out of their cases and to copy them, which I did badly, and even to borrow items, which I took home, including the 9th century leaf I show now, which I brought back one day on the school bus, to the astonishment of my parents. One day in 1964, a newly brought printed Bible of 1472 arrived while I was there, and they photographed me looking at it for a leaflet about their collection. Next, please. That's me on the left, aged 13, reaching out my finger to touch the corner of the page, trembling with excitement. And I still find that tactile encounter with any historic book irresistible. By the early 1970s, I was back in England and working on a thesis on 12th century illuminated manuscripts in Oxford University. Next, please. And by then, I had become obsessed. Manuscripts seemed to me a mixture of history and art and an extraordinary sense of personal interaction, for you can only really study a manuscript by actually touching and turning its pages. From university, I then joined Sotheby's in London. Next, please. Assembling specialized auction sales twice a year. Next, please. This is from the first manuscript I ever described for them, an illuminated manuscript bestiary or encyclopedia of animals, due for sale in November that year. This, as you will immediately recognize, is an Indian elephant. The text tells us that elephants once lived in Africa, as well as in India, but now, and this is the 13th century, they're only found in India. They lived for 300 years. The Indians, it says, build castles on their backs, and they fight the Persians from them. This manuscript was made in Erfurt in North Germany, and the artist knew very little about elephants or Indians. Before the auction, we took this and other German books to an exhibition at Sotheby's in Munich, hoping to find new customers. Next, please. Here is the leaflet announcing the event. When I was there, a man came in with his daughter to show us a manuscript which he owned himself. It was passed across to me to unwrap from the blanket in which it was kept. It proved to be the astonishing volume known today as the Spinola Book of Hours. Next, please. Which is the subject of chapter 12 in the book which I'm advertised as speaking about this afternoon. It was in a class and of a quality 1,000 times higher than any of the books of hours that I'd known in Dunedin. The manuscript I saw in Munich was illuminated probably in Ghent around 1515. It has 84 paintings by several artists, including this. Next, please. Here is the Annunciation, a picture of the Virgin Mary's house, into which we can see by a kind of X-ray vision. The details are endlessly fascinating. Notice the junior angels in the foreground, stealing flowers from her garden. Next, please. Which the Virgin then tactfully puts in a vase on the mantelpiece. Next, please. In the meantime, in another miniature, we can see a parrot and a monkey, next please, on the windowsill, and the owner's collection of medieval silver, which might impress even an Indian Maharaja. I love the details of the shepherd dancing with his dog, next please, which tolerates the indignity with gritted teeth. And here's a wonderful night scene, next please, from a medieval boat. And for today, in the month of January, we can see from the calendar, next, the domestic activity which you should be undertaking right now, which is sitting by the fire with a bottle of drink, which is pretty much how most of us spend our Januaries in Europe anyway. Next, please. In the event, the Spinola Book of Hours was sold at Sotheby's in the summer of 1976 for £370,000, more than 3 times higher than what was then the world record price for any book at auction. And it's now in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. The greatest book at Sotheby's in my time was this. Next, please. This came up for sale in 1983. It's the massive gospel book of Henry the Lion. It was illuminated around 1180 for Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony and founder of Munich, and his wife Matilda, the daughter of Henry II of England, who are shown on both pages. And in this detail, next please, Henry the Lion, holding his gospel book, actually shakes hands with St. Blasius, who is indeed meeting a remarkable manuscript. At the time it came into Sotheby's, this was probably the most spectacular Romanesque manuscript then in private hands. The manuscript is preserved in an extraordinary treasure binding from Prague, with relics of saints under rock crystal, next please, including a finger bone of St. Mark, an example of a text with part of one of the authors attached, a selling strategy which could be adopted by the Festival Bookstore in Jaipur. After an extensive campaign, the Gospel Book of Henry the Lion was sold at Sotheby's in December 1983. Next, please. This is the sale itself, with me standing anxiously beside the rostrum. The manuscript sold for a little over £8 million. For many years, more than twice the highest price then ever paid for any Old Master painting. It was acquired by the German government for the State Library of Wolfenbüttel in Lower Saxony, and I've recently learnt of a new Playmobil model of Henry the Lion. Next, please. Dressed in the costume shown in his manuscript and actually holding the famous book itself. Money is not the only measure of the value of an illuminated manuscript, but it is one gauge in the applausometer, a word invented by Roy Strong, who is here at the festival, a quantifiable scale of the public response to wanting to encounter and experience a work of art itself. No facsimile or digitized surrogate or even Playmobil model has that sense of actual authenticity. I also, for a time, took over administrative responsibility for sales at Sotheby's of Indian manuscripts and miniatures, although I claim no expertise, and we had proper specialists to write the catalogues. But from time to time, I even bought the odd Indian miniature myself, such as this. Next, please. One of the pictures from the famous Hamzanama manuscript, commissioned by the Mughal Emperor Akbar around 1562. And this engaging 17th century drawing from Rajasthan. Next, please. Showing an elephant by an artist rather more acquainted with the animal than the illuminator of medieval Erfurt. That double world of Indian and European miniatures still fascinates me. In 2000, I joined Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, next please, with custodianship of the Parker Library, which is behind the upstairs windows shown here. The college was founded in the mid-14th century as part of the University of Cambridge, but its collection of medieval manuscripts was put together at the Reformation by Matthew Parker. Next, please. Born 1504, died 1575, then master of the college. My colleague this afternoon, Dan Jones, mentions Matthew Parker on page 2, no less, of his new book on the Templars. Parker had been chaplain to Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII. I have no contemporary picture of her, so instead I show you Natalie Portman. Next, please. It was in Anne's circle that the first intimations of Lutheranism had reached England, And of course, it was because of Anne that Henry began the break with Rome, which eventually resulted in the English Reformation. Parker's papers include an autographed letter of Anne Boleyn, next please, written to her father about an imminent visit to France. There's an interesting point of history here. We know a huge amount about Anne Boleyn, especially from the end of her life, but what we don't actually know is when she was born. She would not be the first woman in history, or the last, to be a little vague about the date of her birth. This letter, which is the earliest known, is absolutely in her handwriting, and it was written in 1514. If she was born in 1507, as she claimed, she was 7 when she wrote this letter. Is that possible? Next, please. Here's a detail of the signature. What is your opinion? Just say, and I'm speculating here, she was actually 10 years older than she pretended, and she was 17. That seems plausible. Then, in the 1530s, when she failed to produce a son for Henry, maybe she was actually 40 instead of 30, and that is why. And all the evidence hinges on the handwriting of this one letter in the Parker Library. In November 1558, Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth, found herself queen. Next, please. She summoned Parker to London and made him Archbishop of Canterbury, with instructions to make the English Reformation absolute and irrevocable. We may look back on Elizabethan England as a golden age of a long and stable reign, but they didn't know that. All of Europe was in religious turmoil, quite as ruthless and cruel as it is in the Middle East today, and the new queen wanted to make absolutely sure that no matter what happened to her, England could never, ever become Catholic again. Parker set up the established Church of England in what is known as the Elizabethan settlement, and it is still the national church of Britain today. Matthew Parker sought to convince people that if he went far enough back into English history, he would find evidence of a free English church, independent of Rome and responsible only to the king, with the Bible and church services in the English language. He believed that St. Gregory, in sending the first Christian missionaries to Canterbury in 597, next please, had intended to establish an independent English church unfettered by Rome. Now, Parker was a collector by instinct. In 1568, he obtained license from the Privy Council to gather into his own possession the oldest manuscripts in England, which would provide irrefutable precedent for the Reformed Church. That is why the medieval manuscripts are there. Once again, here is today's theme, that confronting actual books, not reproductions or copies, has a real value as tangible evidence of a political argument. The result is that the Parker Library in Cambridge now has upwards of 500 medieval manuscripts, including about a quarter of all known books in Anglo-Saxon, and almost without exception, the oldest manuscripts in English history. Many of them are in an extraordinary loan exhibition at the British Library right now. Next, please. And any of you who are in London before the 3rd week of February should take every opportunity to see it. The oldest item in that exhibition, lent by the Parker Library, is the Gospel book of St. Augustine, next please, which forms the subject of chapter 1 of the publication I'm supposed to be speaking about this afternoon. The manuscript dates from the 6th century and is probably the oldest object in England of any kind that's not archaeological. Books of such antiquity are almost unknown, even in the ancient libraries of Europe. Bede, describes the arrival in Kent in 597 of St. Augustine, sent from Rome by Gregory the Great, furnished with all that would be necessary for the conversion of England. In the first chapter of that book, I present what I think is a new and convincing argument why this manuscript in the Parker Library really must have been one of the actual books sent to Britain by Gregory, and it eventually became one of the great medieval treasures of St. Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury, now a ruin, next please, from which Parker commandeered it. The manuscript has multiple pictures from the Gospels, almost like comic strips. Next please. Look at the scene at the top center. Next please. Here's a detail. It shows Christ at the Last Supper, at a curious round table. Look carefully at the composition. Note the food on the table. Memorize the pose of Christ in the exact position of his two hands. Note the man to the left of him on Christ's right, with his hand on the table. You were too soon. And the man on the far left in profile. And then compare what you've already been given a preview of, the picture in the Bayeux tapestry. The manuscript was then demonstrably kept in Canterbury. Now, the French have always insisted that the Bayeux tapestry was made in France. This has suddenly become rather topical because last year, Monsieur Macron has offered to lend the tapestry to England for the first time. Next, please. And this afternoon, I offer you absolute proof that the Bayeux tapestry is English anyway. The Gospel Book of St. Augustine is still a volume on which the modern Archbishops of Canterbury still take their oaths of office, for which it was last used at the enthronement of the present incumbent, Justin Welby, in Canterbury in March 2013. Next, please. Here he is at the moment of kissing the actual manuscript. It's a kind of meeting with a remarkable manuscript which only archbishops experience. We took the manuscript down to Canterbury in a security van before dawn that morning. And I felt it was rather like when you've taken your dog on holiday and you're returning home and a few blocks away, the dog on the back seat seems to recognize where it is. And I could imagine the manuscript in its box suddenly realizing with wide-eyed incredulity that it was being driven in through the medieval gates of Canterbury. Next, please. Next, please. And here is me. Next, please. Entering the cathedral through the west door at the start of the first hymn, carrying the manuscript on a cushion under the suspicious scrutiny of the Master of Corpus. Parker also loved books which were associated with kings. He looked for evidence that the monarchy had a historical position in the patronage of the church. Next, please. This is the oldest manuscript of any kind made for a King of England. This too is in the current British Library exhibition. The image looks a bit like me, carrying the Gospels of Augustine. This is the copy of the Life of St. Cuthbert, which was owned by King Athelstan, the grandson and successor of Alfred the Great. In the year 934, Athelstan did what the English always do when they need distraction, and he took an army up to fight the Scots. There have been moments in the last 8 days when Mrs. May might have been advised to do the same. On his way north, King Athelstan stayed with the exiled community from Lindisfarne when the monks were camped at Chesterley Street, just south of Newcastle, and a tactful exchange of books took place. The chronicle of the community records that the king brought them this book. For its whole frontispiece, here it is, shows the king presenting the volume to St. Cuthbert, who, though he was dead, conveniently emerges from his shrine to receive it. It's a wonderfully appropriate royal gift, and the monks preserved it for the rest of their journey. By the 11th century, it was at Durham, next please, where Parker acquired it. In 2013, for the first time since the Reformation, our manuscript returned to Durham as part of the Lindisfarne Gospel exhibition there, next please, which broke all records in the summer. And it even had its own hot dog stand, next please. books can do strange things. On the subject of eating, other manuscripts made for the Royal Libraries include this. Next, please. A chronicle of German history presented to the Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England and protagonist in the civil wars of the 12th century against King Stephen. This drawing shows Matilda's wedding feast in 1114 and is the only contemporary portrait of her. Notice a detail of the food on the table, next please, showing an unmistakable pretzel in front of the royal bride, as I've marked with a blue arrow. I am almost the only person I know who has visited the Pretzel Museum in Philadelphia. And their earliest reference to one is 15th century. The manuscript here, which is very early 12th century, actually belonged to Matilda herself. Next, please. This is from a Life of Christ in French, which belonged to Henry V, who appears in the dedication miniature. In case you wonder how accurate it is, here is Henry V himself, dressed as Laurence Olivier. Next, please. Parker probably assumed that this even more famous book, next please, was a royal copy too, perhaps made, he wrongly thought, for Richard II. It is the greatest manuscript of Chaucer's Troilus. It's a large manuscript with a dazzling frontispiece of royal quality, showing Chaucer reading or reciting his poems to a courtly party gathered around a young prince, a bit like the Jaipur festival. Richard II was the first king of England to speak English as a first language, and here was Parker's evidence that even the kings were reading books in English in the time of Wycliffe. Notice how the narrative of the picture here rises up and up on an almost vertical plane, up past dark green woods and fluid brown rocks to trees and castles on the horizon. Interestingly, you find almost exactly this stylistic feature in later Mughal painting in India. Next, please. Such as this of the 16th century, now in the Fitzwilliam Museum, showing the young Akbar on a hunting expedition. The style probably reached India from Persia, but there is no known or imaginable line of connection through to the much earlier Chaucer manuscript in the Parker Library. Throughout the Middle Ages, India was still unimaginably remote from Europe. A few manuscripts in the Parker Library just touch on distant knowledge of the country. Next, please. This is from a late 12th century Imago Mundi, opening here with the account of India. The volume also includes a map of the world. Next, please. In which you may or may not immediately recognize India as you know it. But look closely, and there is the Indus River. Next, please. And the Ganges. Next. And what I'm especially hoping to see while I'm here this week, those famous mountains of gold. From the 14th century, there's a much longer account of India and its many marvels. Next, please. These include not only exotic peoples, such as pygmies and people who drink salt water and who shelter from the sun under the shade of their single giant feet, but also wonderful animals. Creatures described as unique to India include the lucrota, next please, which is the fastest animal in the world and can talk, and the manticore, next please, which has the face of a man, blue-grey eyes, the body of a lion, a tail like a scorpion, and it eats people. Unique to the forests of India, too, is the peridanes tree. Next, please. This grows delicious fruit, which delights doves, which live in its branches. While they are there, they're safe. But if they leave the tree, a dragon underneath waits for them and can grab them and eat them. You can see why I was especially anxious to visit India. Above all, India was famous in medieval Europe for its elephants. Next, please. This picture was drawn in northern England, probably in Durham, in the 12th century. The text tells that elephants have no joints in their knees, and so if an elephant ever falls over, as here, he can never stand up again. I am assured by elephants of my acquaintance, next please, that this is completely untrue. In the Abbey of Peterborough in East Anglia, they thought that elephants looked like this, next please, with hooves and a blue trunk. The next elephant was seen in Cremona in Italy in 1241, next please. I thought that this would make a wonderful symbol for next year's Jaipur festival, for there is a party taking place on the elephant's back. And there is Sanjoy Roy at the front ringing a bell, and Namita Gokhale at the back, pricking the animal's bottom to make it go faster. Finally, in 1255, an elephant was actually brought to England. Next, please. This picture, made in the Tower of London by Matthew Paris, monk of St. Albans, is the earliest elephant in European art drawn from life. All these manuscripts and many others are displayed in the upstairs room of the Parker Library. Next, please. And I hope that all of you, when in England, will take every chance to see the collection. I always used to be a little bit cautious about inviting too many people for fear that they'd all arrive at once. Next, please. But now that I'm retired, I don't mind how difficult or demanding you are. I must have issued some general kind of invitation once to Caroline Dornay, literary agent, next please, who one day turned up unexpectedly at Corpus with about 20 minutes to spare and said, "Show me a manuscript, any manuscript." And in a rare moment of generosity, I got out the first volume of the great Bible of Bury St. Edmund's Abbey. Next, please. This was made around 1140, illuminated by Master Hugo, the earliest English itinerant artist whose name is known. We turned pages back and forth. Caroline had never actually sat before an original medieval manuscript. Next, please. She asked questions, and I tried to reply. Next, please. And I think we both enjoyed ourselves. In the end, when we put it back into its case, she remarked what a fascinating experience this had all been, and we began to plot whether it would be possible to write a book which attempted to convey to a wider public that vivid experience of meeting an outstanding illuminated manuscript. The result is the publication which I am meant to be discussing. Next, please. Now, recently out in paperback, could we have the picture we saw a preview of? Thank you. It takes as a premise that the originals of the greatest illuminated manuscripts in the world, and I really do mean the top end, are now more or less inaccessible to nearly everyone. Just try to get them to remove the Book of Kells from its exhibition in Dublin. Next, please. I've lost my helper. So that you can turn its pages, or the Codex Amiatinus from its armored display, next please, in the Biblioteca Laurentiana in Florence. It won't happen. They'll no more let you handle such manuscripts than they'd let someone like me see the original cave paintings of Lascaux in France, simply because they are too famous, too important, and they're far too fragile and vulnerable. I often think that handling a great manuscript is rather like meeting a very famous person. It's probably easier to meet the Pope or the President of the United States, or both at once, next please, like the astonished priest on the right, than it is to touch, say, the Codex Amiatinus or the Gospels of St. Augustine. The idea of the book, then, is come with me, O reader, and we're going together to see the Book of Kells itself. Next, please. And the Carmina Burana in Munich. Next, please. The Henguert Chaucer and others. And we're going to sit side by side in a library, and we will turn the pages together, as I did with Caroline Dornay and the Bible of Bury St. Edmunds. As I myself originally envisaged it, the book would have been called Interviews with Manuscripts. The idea was that a proper interview is a more intimate experience than a mere meeting, which sometimes means little more than shaking hands. A well-written, published interview with a celebrity will often recount the whole background of how the encounter was set up and where it took place and who came to the door and what they were wearing, how tall they are and what they give you for lunch and where you sit and what it's actually like when you find yourself in conversation with a supremely famous person. Next, please. It's very similar with manuscripts. Sometimes they're smaller than you expect. Next, please. Next, please. Next. Or bigger than you ever imagined. Next, please. Some illuminated manuscripts, like People, are curiously disappointing after all the build-up, and others, like the Copenhagen Psalter, next please, are simply blow you away. You will have done your homework, but a really good interviewer will extract information which the celebrities were not expecting to divulge. Next, please. And perhaps hardly knew themselves. And there is a voyeurism for the reader in witnessing the encounter in action. In writing the book, I chose a dozen manuscripts over as wide a range as possible from the 6th to the 16th century, and I went to see them all over again. Next, please. This, which is from the Spinola Hours, shows me working in the Getty Museum with the publisher's editor in desperation behind my chair. And the text recounts how the visits took place and where I went and who I met and what I saw. And the idea is that the narrative, like watching a televised interview, admits the reader into the process of examining a manuscript. As with interviews too, there are unexpected discoveries elicited by nothing cleverer than actually meeting the originals. And the reader can eavesdrop on this happening. It's intended to be as if we were sitting side by side together. It's an odd gap in the history of scholarship that the habitat of individual manuscripts has hardly ever been documented. A simple reproduction gives no flavour of where a particular manuscript lives or where historians go to consult it. I love visiting libraries. I'm especially fond of those French provincial libraries, next please, where you consult Carolingian manuscripts, sharing tables with old men reading magazines and children doing their homework. I spent much time as a student in the old municipal library of Troyes in eastern France. You used to go in through a low entrance with two signs with arrows. To the left it said Bibliothèque, and to the right it said Discothèque. The journeys described in the book also take us up the stairs of the State Library in Munich, next please, which is seriously daunting on its vast scale, and to Dublin, of course, next please, with its marvellous long room, and to the Morgan in New York, next please, and to the State Library of St. Petersburg, and to Leiden and Aberystwyth, and to Florence, where the reading room was designed by Michelangelo, no less, next please. And we go to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, looking at a manuscript in the 17th century gallery built in the 1640s for Cardinal Mazarin, and to the startlingly modern Royal Library in Copenhagen, on the waterfront, next please, and to the manuscript study room, as they call it, in the Getty, next please, with it on its hilltop overlooking Los Angeles. But the narrative takes us also to the lovely little library in Salisbury Cathedral, so hard to find that none of the vergers I asked even knew where it was. Though it has been, next please, although it has been up the same medieval staircase directly off the south transept since 1445. And to glimpse manuscripts in Rosano, Abergarammer and Perth in Western Australia. Some libraries make you wash your hands. Another, described here, gave me sticky chocolates to eat as I was turning the pages of one of the most flawless Italian Renaissance manuscripts in existence. In Florence, where I looked at the Codex Amiatinus, probably the most precious of all Latin Bibles, I was left entirely unsupervised, and I could probably have walked out with it, if I could have done so discreetly with something nearly as large as I am and weighing nearly 90 pounds. Next, please. This is only the modern facsimile, but it gives you an idea of the size. Even though this is only a reproduction, note that the users are being made to wear white gloves, which I wasn't with the original. It's a question as to whether or not gloves should be worn when handling manuscripts. I am against it for reasons which I argue so cogently in the context of the Getty Museum that following the publication of chapter 12, they have now abolished the practice there. I think that's my greatest triumph in life. Inquiries into manuscripts are never complete, for there are always things to find out. The manuscript of chapter 7 ends with a portrait of its artist, Hugo Pictor. Next, please. I thought that this was I'm wrong here, because that was the illustration of somebody wearing gloves. Next, please. Enter the portrait of the artist Hugo Pictor. I thought that this was unpublished until 1950. Only 10 days ago, I stumbled on a description of it published in 1854. And to take it the other way, it is, since my own book came out, now available as a beach towel. Next, please. You may not enjoy the book, but buy the towel. One of the aspects of manuscripts which I especially relish is that, like people, they've all had lives. Unlike many archaeological objects which leap from the ancient world into a modern museum with no intermediary history, a manuscript has always been above ground, and it has belonged to someone or some library at every moment since it was made. Next, please. Everyone has followed a journey through history, and disentangling those travelers' tales is undoubtedly part of the fun. There's still a picture behind. Next, please. Now, let's look inside a couple of books. Have you ever wanted a good way to attack an enemy's ship at sea? This time, you cannot fight from the top of an elephant. Next, please. Instead, you fill glass... No, go back, please. One back, please. No, one forward, please. Stop. Instead, you fill glass bottles with poisonous snakes. There are plenty of those in India. You then throw these bottles onto the opposing ship, as you can see at the top here. The bottles smash open on the deck, and the snakes escape and bite the enemy, and you win the battle. In the meantime, a swimmer in the foreground, you can see him here preparing to dive, swims down under the wooden ship with a drill, and he makes a hole in the hull, and the boat sinks. Apparently, it absolutely cannot fail. This is one of many illustrations in a wonderful manuscript called the Semi-Deus, or Half-God. It was written by the humanist and lawyer Catone Sacco, next please, of Pavia, who presented it probably in 1438 to Filippo Maria Visconti, Duke of Milan. The book is full of useful advice on practical warfare, such as attacking a city in a desert. Next, please. I've marked with a blue arrow a cannon which they've dragged all the way in the hot sun. It reminds me of the Ethiopian emperor Tewodros, who did the same in the 19th century. Next, please. The manuscript of the Semi-Deus has other helpful images. Next, please. This one is on how to board an enemy's ship. And the next please, shows how to build a temporary bridge to get an army across a river, and all the way through are successful Visconti knights, next please, and miserable defeated enemies. Next, please. The manuscript is recorded twice in the Visconti and Sforza Library in Pavia. Next, please. When it was in a box of gilded leather. However, in 1499, the French king, Louis XII, considered that he himself had a greater claim to Lombardy than the Sforzas, since he was himself descended from the Viscontis. And he laid siege to Pavia, next please, and defeated and sacked it. Our manuscript was stolen and taken back to France as war loot. It was eventually given to the Royal Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, which was raided by the mob during the French Revolution. Next, please. Once again, a manuscript on warfare became itself a victim of violence. It and other manuscripts, including some looted from the Bastille, were acquired under distinctly unclear circumstances by an enterprising Russian, Peter Dubrovsky, next please, who was obliged to leave France in 1792, taking his new collection with him. In 1805, he sold it to the new Imperial Public Library in St. Petersburg, next please, where 200 years later, I went to see it. There is undoubtedly a certain irony in the fact that a manuscript on preparing for battle was itself a victim of warfare twice, and that it's now in, of all countries of the world, Russia. Next, please. Look carefully at the image of Filippo Maria Visconti receiving a manuscript. Consider his face and haircut. Don't you think he looks rather like Mr. Putin? Next, please. In many ways, disentangling the secrets of a manuscript is not so different from detective fiction. Next, please. We're looking for tiny clues, inscriptions, erasures, offsets, pinprickings, changes of scribe, unexpected mistakes, and so on, which suddenly reveal the answer to the mysteries of a manuscript. If any of you are in any doubt as to a career, manuscripts are truly the most delightful and fascinating of artifacts. I think the provenance I most enjoyed writing about for the book was chapter 9, about the 14th century Book of Hours of Jeanne de Navarre, next please, daughter of Louis X of France. The manuscript includes prayers invoking their family saint, St. Louis. And through an examination of various evolving alterations made to the manuscript, here it is again, it becomes clear that it passed, could we have that one? It becomes clear that it passed like mitochondrial DNA entirely through the female line of the descendants of St. Louis, to Bonne of Luxembourg, Isabella of Bavaria, and then through the unexpected gift of the Duc de Berry, next please, found in his inventory, to the second Joan of Navarre, the wife of Henry IV of England, which brought the manuscript to London, and then to her daughter-in-law, Catherine of Valois, next please, shown in the book's added frontispiece. All of them direct descendants of the family saint. After the extinction of that female line in 1437, the manuscript was given to a nunnery in Paris, which had been founded by St. Louis' widow, next please, which you've just seen in advance, approximately here. It was then borrowed from the nuns in 1621 by the antiquary Nicolas de Peresque, next please, who almost certainly never returned it. Instead, it was acquired by the Irish oligarch of the sugar plantations, Justin McCarthy Ray, in whose posthumous sale in 1817, it was bought probably for Francis Dowse, next please, which should have brought it to the Bodleian in Oxford. But it was acquired instead by Lord Ashburnham for his house in Sussex, next please, and was sold by his heirs in 1897 to Henry Yates Thompson, who extremely nearly agreed in 1919 to sell it for £5,000 to the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, which would have been convenient for me. But when negotiations faltered at the last minute, it was sold at Sotheby's, next please, where it made £11,800 for many years, a world record price for any book. And it was bought exceedingly anonymously by Baron Edmund de Rothschild of Paris, whose portrait appears on Israeli banknotes. Next, please. He died in 1935. In April 1940, the Nazis occupied Paris, and the Hours of Jeanne de Navarre was looted from the Rothschild Bank. For many years, it was untraced, presumed to have been a casualty of the Second World War. One of my discoveries in the archives in Paris was that it was stolen to order, and that it was sent personally in March 1942 to Hermann Goering, next please, shown here with Hitler. On the 4th of April 1945, the 1st French Army and the American 7th Army entered Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps, next please, the site of Hitler's bunker at the Berghof. A manuscript initially mistaken for a brick was picked up by a soldier in the chaos by the railway station and was eventually given by him to a monastery in Brittany, next please. When the monks needed a new roof in 1967, after storm damage, they took it to Paris to see whether it was valuable. And it was recognized as the long-lost hours of Jean de Navarre. Next, please. It was returned to the Rothschild heirs, who offered it to the Bibliothèque Nationale. Then the complications began. It transpired that the German government had been forced in 1958 to pay compensation to the Rothschilds for the loss of the book, valued at 73,200,000 French francs, which sum was paid over in Switzerland on the 3rd of March 1959. Therefore, as happens with any insurance claim where payment has already been made, the Book of Hours no longer belonged legally to the Rothschild family at all, but to the West German government. In theory, it could now be lodged with the National Libraries of West Berlin or Munich. In the event, quite rightly, the French government finally bought it from Germany, and it's now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, next please, where I've held it in my hands a number of times. If a book can be a trigger to the historical imagination, this is certainly a manuscript with the power to do so. Although it very nearly went elsewhere on several occasions, it's now the only one of those 12 remarkable manuscripts in my book which is preserved in the country where it was originally made. Medieval manuscripts, as I learnt very early on in Dunedin, are extremely portable. Next, please. You are all cultured and sophisticated members of an international literary elite. And I don't suppose that any of you do anything quite as mundane as watching popular television. But there is apparently a weekly thriller in America about political espionage called Homeland. In an episode shown last year, there was a languid Russian spy named Simone Martin, played by the French-Canadian actress Sandrine Holt, who's been sent to bring down the American government, but he's hiding out in a safe house in the woods to avoid assassination. She's shown propped up in bed, reading a book. Look at what it is. Next, please. Thank you very much.
Christopher, thank you so much for this phrase is overused, but genuinely a tour de force in which we learned an enormous amount about an enormous number of things. My great learnings, as they say from your talk, are that Anne Boleyn told fibs about her age, that the French told fibs about the Bayeux Tapestry, that the Germans told fibs about elephants, and the way to earn millions from your books is to put a piece of your finger bone on the cover. It was entertaining, it was learned, and this is a manuscript pun. It was truly illuminating. I think we've got time for a couple of questions. We have a question over there.
Any thoughts about the Voynich Manuscript? And fascinating presentation.
The Voynich Manuscript.
The Voynich,
one of my problems of growing older is loss of hearing. I'm really sorry. Did you understand the question?
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on the Voynich Manuscript?
Oh.
Quite mysterious.
The question is, do I have any thoughts on the Voynich Manuscript? Now, you may or may not know, this is an extraordinary manuscript in the Beinecke Library at Yale. Belonged to an American collector and dealer called Voynich, hence his name. And it's some kind of alchemical or magical text written in a language and an alphabet that no one can read. And no one knows what it says, or where it comes from, or where it was made, or what it is, and many people have written about it. It is the most consulted manuscript in the entire library of Yale University, and no one has ever read it. This is a wonderful thing you should remember in a literary festival. You don't have to read books to enjoy them. In fact, my own opinion of that manuscript is that it's a forgery, that it's a complete fake, that it's bogus, and that it means nothing. And I think it was probably made in the 16th century to sell to Rudolf II, the emperor in Prague, who was fascinated by the occult, and the more peculiar they were, the more money he paid for them. And I think it was probably faked up for him. But that's only my own opinion. I mean, it's a wonderful and completely bizarre. There's a facsimile of it now, and you can find pictures of it easily on the internet. But I think it's a forgery.
Fascinating. And one more question, sir.
So it's a fantastic presentation. Here it is. Can you see me? Fantastic presentation, I said. Can you hear me? I'm coming to that. So very intriguing, talking about Jesus, Bible, and hundreds of years of research. But I didn't find any reference of Jesus vis-a-vis India, which was brought out by a gentleman called Holger Kirsten, where he said that with circumstantial evidence that Jesus never died on the cross and actually lived in Tibet and Banaras, where he did his pranayam. The book was published in 16 languages by Penguin, and the Vatican bought over every book under the sun and destroyed it for 15 years. Till now, it is now coming into the open flare. Is it a fact that this happened, and did it find any space in anywhere? And why was Holger Kirsten, a famous German author, denied the right that book should be out, and Vatican was buying everything? Little intriguing, I say.
The question is really whether I have come across any reference to the legend, this is conspiracy theory, to the legend that Jesus did not die on the cross but came to live in India and lived a happy life thereafter. If that was the question, the answer is no. I actually haven't, though St. Thomas, the disciple of Jesus, is reputed to have come here. And of course, there are many aspects of the early Christian religion are very, very similar to the philosophies of India. There's also that theory that Jesus, as a little boy, was taken to Glastonbury in England by Joseph of Arimathea. The point being, how could Jesus have been so clever if he hadn't been to school in England? And I suppose the answer to the question is, how could Jesus have been so successful if he hadn't come to live in India? Thank you.
Well, we solved the mystery of not only the Voynich Manuscript, but of Christ's fate. Now, the clock in front of me says 00, so we must vacate the stage. Thank you so much to Christopher de Hamel. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And to use, I think, the phrase that has been spoken most in this session, next, please.
Thank you very much, Christopher de Hamel and Dan Jones. Just to let you guys all know, we've got music stage at Hotel Clark Samer, and you can buy the tickets from tent number 3. We've got bookmyshow.com, or even at the venue. We've got Usha Uttar playing today. And we've also got Jasbir Jassi in collaboration with Kutle Khan at Clark Samer.
केसरिया